Tonight, we are watching something huge unfold, far away from the front lines, but just as decisive as any battle. After almost 3 years of war, a high-level U.S. Army delegation has landed in Kyiv, not to send more weapons, but to talk about how to end the war. Led by U.S. Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll, they came with one message: Washington has a 28-point peace plan on the table, and it wants answers. But this so-called peace plan doesn't just ask for a ceasefire. It asks Ukraine to freeze the front line, give up territory, limit its army, renounce joining NATO, and help bring Russia back into the global economy. So in this video, we're going to walk through what's really inside this plan, how Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and the US are reacting, and the uncomfortable question, is this peace or pressure? Stay with me and tell me in the comments what you think. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to lay out the pieces on the table. First, what actually happened in the last days? A U.S. military delegation, including Secretary of the Army Daniel Driscoll, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff and senior commanders for Europe, arrived in Ukraine for what they called a fact-finding mission to discuss efforts to end the war. According to multiple reports, they briefed President Zelensky and top Ukrainian officials on a U.S.-drafted 28-point peace framework originally worked out between U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Russian investment chief Kirill Dmitriev during talks in Miami. Think about that for a second. A U.S. envoy close to Trump, a Kremlin-linked negotiator, meeting in private, drafting a plan that decides the future of Ukraine, without Ukraine at the table at the beginning. Later, Ukraine's national security chief was brought in on a technical basis, but the initial architecture came from Washington and Moscow, not from Kyiv. So, what does this plan actually say? According to detailed summaries of the draft, here are some of the most controversial points. The current front line becomes the de facto border in most areas. Russia keeps Crimea, all of Donetsk and Luhansk, plus the Russian-occupied parts of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. Ukrainian troops would have to withdraw from any pockets inside those regions. Ukraine's army would be capped at about 600,000 troops. Kyiv would be blocked from joining NATO, though EU membership would still be possible. No Western troops could be stationed inside Ukraine. In return, Ukraine would receive US-backed security guarantees, and Russia would gradually be reintegrated into the global economy, sanctions eased, and even a possible return to a G8 format. Frozen Russian assets would go into a reconstruction fund, with a share of profits going to joint US-Russian projects and infrastructure. On paper, it sounds like end the war, rebuild the country, give guarantees. But look at the trade-off. Ukraine would legally accept the loss of large pieces of its territory and accept military limits, while the country that invaded gets sanctions relief and a seat back at the big table. President Zelensky has been very careful with his words, but not soft. He told Ukrainians that the country is facing one of the most difficult moments in our history, under intense pressure to accept the plan. He warned that Ukraine may face a very difficult choice, either losing dignity or risk losing a key partner. So imagine being in his position. On one side, a war that has drained lives, cities, and resources. On the other, a plan that might stop the bombing, but at the price of officially giving away land where thousands of Ukrainians died defending their homes. Would you be able to sign something like that? Even Ukrainian analysts talking to Western media describe the document as heavily slanted toward Moscow, saying it's not worth the paper it's written on, in its original form. And yet, Zelensky can't just slam the door. Because if Kyiv is seen as the side that refuses peace, it risks losing support from the very allies that are keeping the country alive. So he plays for time. He talks about dignified peace, about the need for real security guarantees, and sends his top aide, Andriy Yermak, to negotiate line by line. Now let's talk about Europe. At the G20 summit in South Africa, European leaders, plus Canada and Japan, issued a joint statement. They said the US plan includes important elements for a just and lasting peace, but that it needs additional work. Their main concerns? You cannot change borders by force. You cannot leave Ukraine so weak that Russia can attack again in a few years by limiting its army too much. And anything involving NATO or the EU must be agreed by all member states, not decided in a US-Russia side deal. The UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, called Trump to say the draft is a basis which will require additional work. Behind the polite language, that's basically Europe saying, "We see what you're trying to do, but this is not acceptable yet." French President Emmanuel Macron warned that if Ukraine is forced into a bad deal, Europe is preparing the conflicts of tomorrow. So you have a strange alliance here. Ukrainians afraid of losing their dignity, Europeans afraid of breaking the basic rules of international law, and US administration under Trump trying to show it can end the war quickly, even if the first version of its plan felt, as some officials privately put it, like a Russian wish list. All this led to the big Geneva talks. Security advisors from the US, Ukraine, France, Germany, the UK, and the EU met in Switzerland to rewrite the draft and try to bring it closer to something Kyiv and Europe could live with. After the meeting, the White House and Ukraine released a joint statement saying they had produced an updated and refined peace framework and that talks were highly productive. Trump himself said the plan was not his final offer for Kyiv, signaling that some points were negotiable, even after he had publicly given Ukraine a deadline to accept it. Other reporting suggests this new version slightly softens the most extreme demands and adds more language about Ukraine's dignity and long-term security, leading some analysts to say it could eventually become a deal Kyiv might accept, but not yet, not in this form. Still, another side of the story comes from Moscow. According to commentary relayed in U.S. conservative media, a New York Post piece titled "Nothing But Nyet" suggested that Russia itself might reject the plan or drag its feet, hoping to win more on the battlefield, meaning the war would likely drag on at least past Christmas. So we're in this paradox. Ukrainians think the first draft is too generous to Russia. Europeans think it's too risky for Europe. Some Russian-leaning voices still insist it doesn't go far enough. If all sides are unhappy, is that a sign the plan is balanced? Or just a sign that nobody truly trusts anybody anymore? On top of all this, there's another story that adds more controversies. According to reporting in The Guardian, Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff allegedly told senior Kremlin advisor Yuri Ushakov in an October phone call that for peace to work, Ukraine would have to give up Donetsk to Russia. If that's accurate, it means a key U.S. negotiator was privately signaling acceptance of Russia's maximalist demands before Ukraine or many European allies even saw the full text of the plan. For Ukrainians, that feeds a deep fear. Are deals about our future being cut without us, between Moscow and Washington? For Europeans, it raises another question. If the U.S. cuts side deals that affect European security, how much say do we really have? And for Russia, this could be read as encouragement to hold out for more, to keep fighting longer, in the hope that the West will eventually push Ukraine even harder to concede. We also have to zoom out. While all this is happening in Europe, China is continuing a serious military buildup in the Asia-Pacific. Analysts at Chatham House say Beijing is building a force meant to be able to fight and win wars, and that its weapons production is already massively greater than that of the United States. Some war games suggest any U.S. victory in a conflict over Taiwan would come at a huge cost. In other words, the U.S. is trying to end one major war in Europe, while preparing for the possibility of another crisis in Asia. With limited resources, political fatigue at home, and a world watching to see whether Washington still has the will to stand by its allies. So another uncomfortable question appears. Is this peace plan shaped only by justice for Ukraine, or also by American grand strategy, trying to free up attention and resources for a looming confrontation with China? If you were in Washington, would you accept a less than perfect peace in Ukraine to avoid a two-front challenge, even if it means Ukrainians live with a painful compromise?